The event that we have promised tonight is a part of the British Academy's Future of the Corporation event, Future of the Corporation, Economics, Economy and Society. And the particular event is subtitled Reforming Capitalism to Tackle Our Anxieties and Bring About Better Business for the Greater Good. So a huge number of words there we can latch onto, one of them being anxiety, which I think is very appropriate. The event's organised by the British Academy with the Leeds Social Science Institute and Leeds University Business School. Thanks to Adam Crawford for his role, and Katie Barclay and Rhys Gillard of the LSSI, and Kat Reaney of LUBS, who've helped to organise this, and we owe them a great debt. Okay, without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Professor Lisa Roberts, the Deputy Vice-Chancellor for Research, who will introduce tonight's event. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me without the microphone? Great. So, yes, I'm the Deputy Vice-Chancellor for Research and Innovation here at the university, and it's my job really to say welcome to the evening's event. Which is hosted, as you've heard, by both the Leeds University Business School and the Leeds Social Sciences Institute in collaboration with the British Academy. And I'd particularly like to welcome our speakers, Professor Sir Paul Collier, who is Professor of Economics and Public Policy at the Blavatnik School of Government, and a Professorial Fellow of St Antony's College. And Professor Colin Mayer, the Peter Moores Professor of Management Studies at the Said Business School at Oxford. He is also Professorial Fellow of Wadham College and an Honorary Fellow of Oriel College and St Anne's College. And also welcome to our panellists, Professor Peter Buckley and Stephanie Burris, somewhere, she's moved behind me, from the AHEAD partnership. I'd also like to say a special welcome. I know there are some Leeds alumni here this evening, so welcome to you, and to external visitors to the university. Great that you've made the trek in the very cold weather to come and be with us. So we're really happy to host the event at the university tonight, and clearly the topic of the seminars and the panel discussions that you're going to hear is very topical. But it's also very relevant to the work that we do here at the university, particularly within the business school and within the Leeds Social Sciences Institute, the LSSI. As many of you will know, I'm sure, we're a top 10 UK and a top 100 global university, and the work we do is very much globally connected and regionally impactful, and that's really important to us as a university. Looking at the Leeds University Business School, as you know, it's one of the UK's foremost business schools. It's ranked in the top 10 for the quality of its research, which I'm pleased to say covers a diverse range of expertise. Interdisciplinary research, so working very much across departments and schools and faculties and disciplines, and research that takes a real systems approach to challenges, is one of the key strengths that we have at Leeds, and something that we're increasingly known for internationally and nationally, whether it's working on a regional problem or whether it's working on a global challenge. And all the research within the business school is conducted again within these multidisciplinary research centres. And those LUBS research centres connect knowledge with user communities outside of the university to really promote impact, and they really provide a vibrant and stimulating and supportive environment for our students and our early career researchers. As I mentioned, research in the school has both regional, national and global impact, and our academics are regularly engaging and advising government departments and agencies within the UK and overseas from their research. So I just want to pick out a couple of high-profile examples. So we have something called COINS, which is a complex and open innovation for networked society. And this is a network that creates a sustainable platform for researchers to engage in collaborative production of knowledge by investigating challenges for managing processes of complex and open innovation, created by advances in digital technology. This project's funded by the European Union's Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Programme, and it's based on a strategic partnership between the business school and Ericsson. And the network's researchers study the development of innovation capabilities that are required for organisations of all different types to effectively respond to the institutional, social and technological challenges in innovation ecosystems. Another project, which is called Raising the Ceiling on Diversity and Inclusion, this is a corporate retail case study and partnered with the UK corporate retailer Marks and Spencer's. And this is a 3-year ESRC funded research project that aims to understand and improve our knowledge of the effective and successful implementation of diversity and inclusion strategies in the retail sector and organisations more broadly. You can see that our research is clearly responsive to the external world and what's going on around us, and we're also quick to spot opportunities in which we think we can have an impact. And for example, if we're looking to the future, we've recently established a new Centre for Financial Technologies, or FinTech. This is also led from the business school, but represents again that interdisciplinary collaboration with researchers in engineering and computer sciences, data analytics and social sciences. We'll formally launch the centre later this year, and we've got some really exciting plans for what we wish to achieve, not only within the university, but again working with external organisations and businesses. It's also important to recognise the contribution of our international business researchers to the external reputation of the business school. And the Centre for International Business at Leeds, which was established by Peter Buckley in the late 1990s, has since been recognised as really one of the world's leading centres of expertise on international business. And so it's really great that Peter's taking a role this evening, and he's been instrumental in getting this event off the ground. As I mentioned, the event's also co-hosted by the Leeds Social Sciences Institute, or LSSI, and the director, Professor Adam Crawford, is also here tonight. So the Leeds Social Sciences Institute is, again, a large and vibrant and interdisciplinary research institute that works to support and enhance the social sciences at Leeds. And it brings together, as I've said before, researchers from very many areas of the university, from arts, humanities and cultures, business, education, social sciences and law, the environment faculty, medicine and health. And its primary objectives are to support interdisciplinary working and to foster links between the research community here, but also external organisations, in order to address relevant societal challenges and support research that has true impact. And it's also to provide training to the next generation of social science research leaders. And I'm delighted to report something that's really hot off the press, so it's just been announced today. The LSSI has been awarded an ESRC Impact Acceleration account, which provides £1.3 million of funding over the next 4 years to the LSSI. And that will be used in very flexible, responsive and creative ways, and it will enable vital knowledge exchange, research impact and capacity building and training opportunities to take place, and really support social sciences research across the university. And it's even greater that the fact that this is the largest award that's been made by the ESRC to Leeds. So great congratulations to all involved, and particularly Adam for his leadership. So the IA will support a portfolio of activities which really maximises the potential for the impact of the social science research that we do, and contributes to both the economic and societal development, again, regionally, nationally and internationally. So finally, I just want to emphasise the university's commitment to working with business, public and third sector organisations. And I think this is exemplified by the opening in March of Nexus. And some of you may have seen it if you walk up Woodhouse Lane, which is our new innovation hub. It's more than just a building, very much so. Nexus is going to provide seamless access to the external community, to our world-leading expertise and capabilities and facilities. It's supported by the £40 million investment in the building, which is really going to be a really vibrant and state-of-the-art place to house startups and SMEs, but also smaller teams from larger organisations and larger businesses to allow them to access the academic community, and will really show a step change in the way that we work with external partners. All that's left for me to say now is enjoy the evening. I'm sorry I cannot stay with you, but I have to rush off to something else. I would love to have heard the debate that I'm sure will go on later. I'm sure there'll be some thought-provoking talks and discussion later. But for now, thank you, enjoy the evening, and it's back to Peter, I think.
Thank you. Paul to...
Well, thanks very much for coming on a chilly evening. I'm Paul Collier, and I'm the first half of our double act. We are a double act where, as you'll gradually realise, there's a common core to what we say, though we've got slightly different foci. I'm looking at the broader society, and within that, Colin's looking at the corporation. And Colin, if he does what he sometimes does, has a beautiful wrap-up at the ending, which in about 5 sentences summarises both our books. That doesn't excuse you for not reading them. This is my book called The Future of Capitalism, Facing the New Anxieties. As you'll see, there's £5 off. And the essence of it is this business of facing the new anxieties. And capitalism is an essential system. It's been going about 250 years, and in 15,000 years of civilization, it's the only system we've sort of stumbled on that is capable of continuously raising living standards of the mass of the population. So that's why capitalism really, really matters. By capitalism, I mean decentralized decisions taken in firms that are subject to the discipline of competition against each other. There's no one God in control of every decision. Right? Nor is it taken just a set of individuals, little individuals with no scale, no specialization. Right? So capitalism is this very good compromise between the tiny and the monolithic. But, and this is very important, but it doesn't work on autopilot. You can't just leave it and it will just keep on lifting all boats. And periodically, in the last 250 years, capitalism has derailed. And I think at least 3 times it's derailed really badly. And we're living in one of those periods of derailment now. And I'll return to that in a little while. But first I want to talk about the other 2 derailments. At least the second derailment everybody knows about. It was the mass unemployment of the 1930s. Right? That was a spectacular derailment. But I'm going to talk about the first derailment, partly because not so many people are conscious of it, and partly because it happened right here, where you're living, where I grew up, the big industrial cities of the north of England. This was the birth, globally, the birth of capitalism. 10 miles from where I was born was the world's first factory. Because of that, it's now a World Heritage Site. Right? The first mill. And people flocked to these factories because they became more productive. Right? So that was the miracle of productivity performed in factories, and especially when you brought factories together in the same city, scale and specialization. ordinary people became dramatically more productive. That's what Adam Smith noticed, right? The miracle of productivity. But as they flocked into these cities, there was no public policy to match. There was capitalism, what was happening in the factory, but no corresponding public policy to manage the city. And what happened was that these cities turned into the nearest approximation to hell on earth we have ever had outside the conditions of war. To give you, to make it concrete, I'm going to talk about the boom city of Europe in the mid-19th century. The boom city of Europe was just along the road from here. It was Bradford. In fact, my grandfather, who grew up in an impoverished German village, left Germany and came to Bradford. Boomtown, right? The richest, most fast-growing city in Europe. And by the 1840s, the tragedy of people flocking to these new industrial cities with no public policy had reached a crescendo, and nowhere more so than Bradford. The biggest industrialist in Bradford, who invented a new textile technology, the biggest employer, Titus Salt, by the late 1840s, he was the mayor. He was the big guy in town. And what happened in Bradford in 1849 was cholera. No public policy, no separation of the drinking water from the sewage, and so cholera. And it wasn't just cholera, because people were herded together in dreadful little back-to-back houses, the diseases spread. And so life expectancy in these northern cities totally collapsed. If you were a rural labourer in the 1840s, things weren't great. Your life expectancy was mid-30s. In the northern cities, by the 1840s, it had fallen to 19. Your life expectancy was just, on average, 19 years. So these were hell on earth. What was interesting, amazing really, is that on both the business community and in ordinary families, it produced the same response. Here were these desperate new anxieties. People were dying, where were they going to live? And the business community and ordinary families responded in the same, in kind. And that response is the essence of what a healthy society needs to be able to cope with these derailments of capitalism. So let me start with business. I'm going to do business and families because there are only three vital organizations that determine our lives in a modern society. One is what firms do, because that's where we work. Firms and similar organizations in the public sector. One is families. The core role of families is to look after each other, to rear children. And finally the state, which is a sort of residual. So there's a role for each, all three of them. So what did firms do? What did Titus Salt do? There he was, the biggest businessman in Bradford, mayor, and thousands of people were dying. Well, I think it sort of seared his soul. And so he became the first business philanthropist in the world. He was the Bill Gates of his time. He'd built a fortune, he gave it all away. Right? He recognized he'd got obligations to his workers. They were dying, and so he built an entire new town to house them, which was a decent town. He was Titus Salt at Saltaire, not very far from here. Like that first factory, Saltaire is now a World Heritage Centre, quite rightly so, right? Titus Salt was the pioneer of that business philanthropy in these new towns, which then Lever Brothers, Cadbury, and so on all imitated later. And And then he recognised his obligations not just to his workers, but to the local community. And so the rest of his fortune he gave away to build parks, create a better Bradford. Right? And those of you who've been down the road to Bradford will know that, you know, in the centre of Bradford there's still the statue to Titus Salt, and indeed it became the biggest, when he died, it was the biggest funeral that Bradford ever had. I just did an interview with a journalist whose mother was from Bradford, so he'd taken the precaution, he'd phoned his mum before the interview and said, "You heard of this guy Titus Salt?" And she said, "Of course I've heard of him, he's the city's hero." Now that was in 2019, he was doing stuff in the 1840s, right? So he recognised his obligations, and his workforce and the citizens honoured him in return. They said, what you've done is worthy of esteem. Right? So that was what was happening in the business community, very properly so. And meanwhile, what was happening in the families who were suffering all these anxieties? Right? Well, you don't have to go far from here to come to another northern city where families worked out exactly the same structure of we will build obligations to each other which practically, pragmatically address the new anxieties we face. And that was Rochdale. What happened in Rochdale? Again in the 1840s, that's when it happened, this crescendo of anxieties. It was the birth of the global cooperative movement. Last year I got a citizenship award from the Belgian cooperative movement, which is huge. Right? It runs the National Health Service in Belgium for a start. It's massive. It's the only organisation in Belgium I could see which actually worked across the division of the two language groups. So there it is. You know? So I said, well, how did this Belgian cooperative movement get going? And he said, oh, it got started in Ghent. And it got started in Ghent because a group of people came over from Rochdale and taught it. Huh? So that was the spread from these northern cities, this hell on earth and the responses which has changed the world. So in both cases, amongst families and amongst business, what was happening was reciprocal obligations being built. You accepted obligations to others, and in return for accepting obligations to others, you got rights back, right? And they were focused on pragmatic responses to the new anxieties. So, for example, the cooperative movement became the biggest funeral director in the country. If you were going to die at 19, you were rather worried about that, who was going to bury you. Again, not far from here, you get to Halifax. Where are you going to live? Well, you save, and in return that builds you an entitlement to borrow a mortgage. That's where you're going to live. Right? And the Halifax Building Society became the biggest bank in Britain. Right? So these were the common responses to that first derailment. And now let me get to the present derailment. It became very manifest in 2008, but it's much deeper than just the banks blowing themselves up. And it dates from, it's been going on for about 40 years, and it's two new rifts that opened up. They were new, as I'll see. So the first rift is a new spatial rift between a booming metropolis and cities, provincial cities, which periodically became broken. And that was a very new phenomenon because for the previous 200 years, not just in Britain but globally, you tended to have a force of spatial convergence. The poorer regions were catching up with the richer. 40 years ago, that went into reverse. The other new rift was what I think of as the new class system. It's nothing to do with the old class system, wealth and inherited wealth and position. It's the people who've, like you, are getting a good education at a university, and the people who have lesser education, right? And on the back of that good education that you're getting or have, you're able to master skills that require a lot of cognitive training. And so you find yourselves getting more and more skilled. Whereas the less well-educated, they built manual skills, non-cognitive skills. And a lot of those skills are becoming less and less valuable. These things coincide. You get a lot of skilled people concentrated in a booming metropolis, and they're on the ever-rising escalator. They've never had it so good. Right? And then in the provinces, you get a lot of less skilled people, and their skills are becoming less and less valuable, and they feel alienated and neglected. Right? The economic processes that produce those two new divergences are pretty straightforward. One is globalization. 50, 60 years ago, most markets were national markets. Now, a lot of markets that were national are global. Scale economies in clusters mean that there's less room for winners. There's a few very big winners rather than many smaller winners. And you get periodically the rise of a new global cluster which defeats an old global cluster. That's what happened to my hometown, Sheffield. Sheffield had been a world-class steel industry, right? And indeed, Sheffield had been a centre for steelmaking for 700 years. There's a line in Chaucer, the knife was made in Sheffield, you know. And many of you will know that in the early 80s, the Sheffield steel industry broke. It was defeated essentially by South Korea. And that's encapsulated very movingly in the film The Full Monty. And you know, those were my relatives living there. Yeah? So that's globalization producing this spatial pattern. And then the skill thing is due to the price we pay for ever-rising productivity is greater complexity. You know, the really obvious things were done in the 19th century, and the less obvious things were done by the 1950s, and now, to raise productivity, we do some really difficult things. And those really difficult things, to master that complexity, you need a lot of tertiary education, on which you then build these specialist skills. And by some weird chance, I've lived both these divides. You know, I'm now living in the postcode which is about the ultimate metropolitan boom, and I've got education coming out of my ears, right? But not only did I grow up in Sheffield, but both my parents left school when they were 12. And indeed, right at the beginning of the book is a rather poignant picture of two little children aged about 4. And that's myself and my cousin, and we were born on the same day. And until we were 14, our lives developed in parallel from very much similar base. And then they started to diverge, and they diverged big time. And a lot of the passion in the book is because of this divergence, which was just allowed to continue, and which policy should have built a load of buffers to stop those personal derailments, just as it should build buffers to stop the national derailment that we've been suffering. So, what can we do? That's the tragedies we've now got, and there are actually plenty of things we can do to put things back on track. But what I want to discuss in my last few minutes is what was astounding was this time, this derailment, nothing was done. For 40 years, we didn't do public policy that healed these rifts. There's a lot of things we can do to heal them, and in questions I'm happy to point it out. The 2/3 of the book is not what's the problem, it's what we can do about it. But I want to spend my last few minutes on why This time round, were these things neglected for 40 years? Because the first derailment, the public health crisis, was pretty rapidly fixed up. There was a huge increase in public policy. You look at Leeds Town Hall, Sheffield Town Hall, these were the visible expressions of a massive shift towards public policy to improve these industrial cities. The second derailment, the mass unemployment. Within 15 years, we were back, we'd cracked it. But for 40 years, these new derailments, which are actually rather easier to crack. They're not easy, but they're easier. And nothing's been done. So why did that happen? And the answer is that somehow we had shifted away from the idea that new anxieties would be met by these pragmatic attempts at building reciprocal obligations. That's the solution that works. Right? It's pragmatic. By pragmatism, I mean we don't come at it with an ideology. We don't say, whatever the problem, here's the text which answers it for all time. We don't say, here we're heading to this permanent utopia, and here's the book that guides us. There is no permanent utopia. Right? We're on a sort of unpredictable path, and periodically we create new problems. We have to study those problems in the context and come up with things that work for a while. That's pragmatism. Yeah? That's what we did. It's not what we're doing. Why? Because both the left and the right, politically, got captured by ideologies. Different ideologies, but equally damaging ideologies that distracted from this core business of let's build reciprocal obligations. The genius of reciprocal obligations is that the rights you generate are precisely matched by the obligations you generate. And so it's a sort of non-inflationary process of greater morality. Right? You meet the anxieties without, but you're able to meet them. So on the right, and Colin will talk about this a lot more, a new doctrine set in, generated by Milton Friedman, a completely radically divergent doctrine from the past, which was that the sole purpose of business is to make profits for its shareholders. Right? Titus Salt was a bloody idiot who let things down, let the system down by wasting his money on his workers and his community. So Colin will talk a lot more about that. That was the disgrace on the right, in effect. But we had a similar thing on the left, where the left got captured by utilitarianism. Utilitarianism applied to, which was captured by economics and by lawyers. And utilitarianism was a wacky philosophy generated by a couple of really odd guys, Bentham and Mill, in the mid-19th century. If it hadn't been for economics, nobody would take them seriously for a moment. They were both really weird people. Mill was brought up with no interaction with other children. He learned Greek. And Bentham, just to indicate how wacky he was, when he died, he had himself stuffed so that he could continue to chair meetings. This is kind of seriously, this guy should have been in an institution, but not a university. Right? Anyway, instead, they became hugely influential, because what utilitarianism said was, people maximize utility. We're greedy little shits who maximize our own selfish utility, but you can add up these utilities. And economists agreed, everybody's greedy little shit, but we need to have some economics of public policy We need to be able to maximize global utility, and we do that just by adding everybody up, and then maximizing it. Simple, right? Little problem, if we're all greedy little shits, who's going to do the maximization? And there, they reach back to Plato, because Plato had hit on it. What Plato said was, forget all this democracy, that's awful, right? What we need is a world run by a set of guardians, right? Platonic guardians. And then Plato made what economists regarded as a silly little slip. He thought that the Platonic guardians should be philosophers, and economists put him right on that one, right? So economists' job was to set the tax and incentive system so that these greedy little shits would work as hard as possible. That's the carrot and stick model. You've got a beautiful display of it just outside, right? A guy on a bicycle with a boot behind him and a carrot in front of him, right? So that's what economics built as principal agent theory. And then allied with that, you've got this idea that you guys are productive, but you've got a lot of consumption, and you guys are unproductive and you haven't got much consumption. So the problem for you guys is you need more consumption. So we'll tax you lot, keep the carrot and the boot and the carrot there. We'll take some consumption off you and give it to you, and you're now happy. Right? Because all you are is consumers. Right? Where has the morality gone in this story? Where's the Titus salt behaving morally? Where's the families building reciprocal obligations, accepting obligations to each other? All this morality has disappeared up to the gods at the top. Right? This is social paternalism, a top-down system run by a few gods, and you're all right because you're only consumers. You've no moral agency. You just want to consume, and here you are. Right? You're on benefit stream. And of course, this is a travesty of what humans are. Right? Humans are moral agents who want the dignity of being able to contribute to society, and for that, you lot need to be productive. Right? And so the challenge of healing these rifts is indeed to make the less well-educated in the provincial cities much more productive. Right? And who should pay for that? The people in the boomtown agglomerations who think they are individually earning all this high productivity, when actually a lot of their productivity is thanks to what's called the economic rents of agglomeration. It's not individual productivity, it's the whole metropolis which is raising those incomes. So to finish, let me just conclude with some evidence from social psychology on what sort of people we really are. And this is something you can all try tonight, though it's quite painful. Right? And it's this. You write down what are the 3 things in my life I most regret. The 3 decisions I took that I most regret. Right? Well, I can tell you that the social psychologists have added all this up. And if we were greedy little economic man, right, we'd expect to find, I wish I'd got that job, I wish I'd bought Apple shares, I wish I'd bought that house. They don't feature. Right? If we were the individualist achievers that are very fashionable in the American libertarian movement at the moment, what am I about? I'm trying to realize my inner self. Right? What a load of crap, right? That doesn't feature either, right? What features as the top 3 regrets is pretty well the same for everybody, is I let my mother down. I let my colleagues down. I let my kids down, right? It's regrets where we breach an obligation. That's what hurts. We are naturally moral agents, and we need to get back to that. Thanks very much.
Good Evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Colin Mayer, and I'm the second part of this double act. And I'm going to be talking to you about the most important institution in our lives. I'm not talking about state, religion, or indeed Leeds Business School. I'm talking to you about an institution that clothes, feeds, and houses us, that employs us, and invests our savings. It's the source of economic prosperity and the growth of nations around the world. But at the same time, it's been the cause of inequality, environmental degradation, and mistrust. And in response to that, the British Academy a year ago launched a program of research on the future of the corporation, how it should look in 20 or 30 years' time to address the social, environmental, and political difficulties that it faces, as well as to take advantage of the remarkable technological opportunities that are currently in progress. And it brought together people from across the humanities and the social sciences to address that issue and to work with business leaders in identifying what the primary issues are to be addressed. And it produced its report last November. And at the same time, I published my book, which is entitled Prosperity, Better Business Makes the Greater Good, which is discounted at £4, not £5. But don't suffer from discount delusion, because it is still cheaper than Paul's book. Every year for the past 35 years, Ipso Mori, the market research company, has undertaken a survey of 1,000 people in Britain about which professions they trust to tell the truth. At the top come nurses, doctors, teachers, and I'm pleased to say, university professors. We might not have much power, pay, or prestige, but at least people trust us to do nothing, earn nothing, and take no credit for it. At the other end come business leaders, just ahead of professional footballers, estate agents, journalists, and rock bottom come politicians. And they come below trade union officials and the man and woman in the street. And this isn't just a banker's phenomenon, because business leaders actually come below bankers. And it's not just a post-financial crisis phenomenon, because it's been true for most of the 35 years for which the survey has been done. Mistrust in business is profound, pervasive, and persistent. Why is that the case? Well, I'd suggest the answer to that is the Friedman Doctrine, named after Milton Friedman, which says that there is one and only one social purpose of business: to increase profits so long as it stays within the rules of the game. And that doctrine has been the basis of business policy, business practice, and business teaching around the world ever since. But it wasn't always so. Indeed, business, or the corporation, was established under Roman law 2,000 years ago to perform very public functions. And for nearly all of its 2,000 year history, it has combined its commercial activities with a public role. It's only over the last 60 years, since the Friedman Doctrine, that the idea has emerged that the only purpose of business is to produce profits. And that has been the source of inequality, environmental degradation, and mistrust. And it's going to get worse, because although technological advancement offers tremendous opportunities for enhancing our social well-being, it also poses serious social risks. And as technology accelerates, then the leg of public policy behind business innovation gets longer and longer. But things are changing. 2 weeks ago, the CEOs of the largest corporations in the world received a letter from one of the most influential people in the world who can change the lives of millions of people. That letter said that every business should have a purpose, not a tagline or a marketing campaign, but a statement of the fundamental reason for its being, what it does every day. The sole purpose is not to produce profits, but an emanating force for achieving them. That person is the CEO and president of BlackRock, the largest fund manager in the world, commanding $6 trillion of assets under management. And he's not the only leader of a major investment management firm that has made such statements. So have the leaders of Vanguard and State Street. And so too have many policy makers. The Financial Reporting Council published yesterday its stewardship code regarding how investment institutions should manage their funds. And that placed purpose at the center of what those investment funds should be doing. Last July, it produced the Corporate Governance Code, which states that companies should structure their corporate governance around their corporate purposes, not simply around producing profits. In the United States, Elizabeth Warren, the presidential candidate, has put forward her Accountable Capitalism Act, which states that the largest corporations in the United States with revenues in excess of $1 billion need to have charters, public charters, which state a public purpose. And in France, President Macron has stated that raison d'etre, an intrinsic form of purpose, should be included in the French Commercial Code. Now, these are illustrations of the scale, the breadth, the speed of change that is in progress. But what is required is an understanding that we need to fundamentally reconceptualize our notions of business around why they are created, why they exist, what are they there to do, namely the purposes of business. And from those purposes should then follow business practice and policy towards business. Because the purpose of business is not to produce profits. The purpose of business is to produce profitable solutions to the problems of people and planet. And in the process, it produces profits, but profits are not per se the purpose of business. Everyone who runs successful businesses knows that to be the case. And they don't profit from producing problems for people and planet. Now, behind that lies the trustworthiness of business to uphold those purposes. And what determines that trustworthiness are the values of the business and its culture, values and culture of integrity and a commitment to those corporate purposes. To achieve that outcome, then there are 4 sets of policies that are required. The first is around law and regulation. Law presently is about the rights of shareholders and the duties of directors of companies to uphold the interests of their shareholders. That's not what the law should be about. Corporate law should be about the obligations on owners to state a purpose and for the directors of companies to have a fiduciary duty to uphold those purposes. And regulation, as I was just describing it in relation to the Friedman Doctrine, is viewed as being about the rules of the game. It's not just about that. It's about aligning those commercial purposes of companies with a public purpose. The second set of policies is in regard to ownership and governance. Ownership at present we equate with the shareholding of companies. But that's not what ownership should be about. Ownership is about the ownership of a corporate purpose and the responsibilities on the owners to deliver on those corporate purposes. And those owners can take a variety of different forms, of which shareholders are only one. It could be equally employees or customers or the state or foundations or families. A whole series of different types of owners can be associated with the delivery of those purposes. And governance is currently, the corporate governance of companies, as you might well have been taught in your courses, is currently viewed as being aligning the interests of management with their shareholders. But as I was just saying, in this country at least, we're at last recognizing that's not what corporate governance should be about. It's about aligning the interests of management with that of their purposes, the delivery of their purposes. The third set of policies in relation to measurement and performance. At the moment, what we measure is financial capital in company accounts and their physical capital, their plant, buildings, machinery, etc. We don't account properly for their natural capital, their human capital, and their social capital. And those should be regarded as important as financial and physical capital. And in terms of performance, what we measure is just the profits of companies net of the cost of maintaining their physical capital. But we take no account of the cost of maintaining natural capital, human capital, and social capital. And when we measure profits, that's what we should take account of as well. And the final set of policies relate to finance and investment. At the moment, finance is about contractual relations between providers and users. And we don't recognize that it should be about a relationship between the suppliers of capital and the users of capital. And the reason why it's all about contracts is that, first of all, our tax system favors debt over equity, which is inherently a contractual form of funding. And secondly, regulation encourages dispersed ownership of a large number of individual and in particular institutional investors with whom it's impossible for companies to have relationships. And those relationships should not just be between companies and investors, it should also be between companies and governments. Because in many cases, the private sector cannot fund adequately large-scale, long-term investments, in particular in infrastructure, and those need a real partnership between the public and the private sector. Now, this all matters, not just for business, not just for investors, but for us as societies, communities, and nations. In 1759, the Dowley Ironworks Company was established in Merthyr Tydfil in Wales. It grew to be one of the largest iron producers in the world, supplying, for example, Brunel's railroad, the Great Western region, and the railroads of North America, Europe, and Russia. It merged with a number of families to form Gascoigne and Nettlefold. And at the beginning of the 20th century, there then occurred a remarkable transformation of that company from being an iron and steel producer to, by the end of the century, being one of the largest suppliers to the automobile industry and to the aerospace industry, then known as GKN. And what brought about this transformation of Gascoigne and Nettlefold into GKN was a series of acquisitions in which it engaged that completely transformed the business. But in the process of that transformation, it issued equity. And as it issued equity, then it diluted the ownership of the families to a point that those families then eventually lost control, and it became a dispersed ownership company amongst a large number of institutional investors. And a year ago, GKN was subject to a hostile bid by the private equity turnaround company Melrose, and in March last year, it disappeared as an independent company. It's a story that has been repeated throughout British industry. Cadbury disappeared in 2010 as an independent British company when it was taken over by the American company Kraft. And the British used to have one of the largest electronics and electrical engineering industries in the world, the largest chemical industry in the world. But those two went through process of acquisition, merging together until there was just one electronic company left, namely GKN, and one chemical company left, namely ICI. And when the former of those went bankrupt in the 1990s, and the second was broken up in the 1980s and the 1990s, then so disappeared Britain's electrical, electronic, and chemical industries. Now, what is happening here is that, in essence, that through this process of the stock market diluting ownership, we end up with companies that have dispersed ownership, where it is impossible for companies to have relations with their investors, because you cannot have a relationship with the anonymous. And that is exactly what a dispersed ownership company is. You can have a relationship with an identifiable family owner, but not with an anonymous, dispersed set of shareholders. Now, the reason why this is important is that it's fundamental to our notions of capitalism. The traditional concept of capitalism is that it is an economic system based on private ownership of the means of production and their operation for profit. And ownership is regarded as being a bundle of rights over assets that give their possessors strong authority over those assets. And companies are viewed as being nexuses of contracts managed by boards of directors for the benefit of their owners. In other words, capitalism is regarded as being an internally consistent system by which owners of companies control those companies for the purpose of producing profits that it's then the responsibility of the management to deliver. And what, in principle, aligns those private interests of owners and managers with our public interests as members of society are competitive markets, and where markets fail, then regulation. But there's a parallel system of capitalism. And it's a system that says capitalism is an economic and social system to produce profitable solutions to the problems of people and planet by private and public owners who do not profit from producing problems for people and planet. And ownership, then, is not a bundle of rights, but a set of obligations and responsibility to uphold those purposes and commitments. And firms are not simply nexuses of contracts, but nexuses of relations of trust based on principles and values that are upheld by boards of directors. Now that too is an internally consistent set of ideas which says that capitalism is about solving problems and the responsibilities and duties of owners and directors to ensure that companies do that. Now, the reason why this is not just aspiration, but potentially a reality, is that the corporation is just a legal concept. It's a creation of the law. And the law can therefore specify that companies need to define their purposes and demonstrate how their ownership and governance ensures that they deliver on those purposes and impose obligations on owners and directors to do that. And the reason why this is so important is that there is a void, if not a chasm, between market efficiency and regulatory effectiveness, where we have both market failures and government failures that require us to be able to trust corporations to avoid the economic, social, and political problems that otherwise arise. We need those relations of trust to convert our self-interest into a communal, cooperative interest in the common purpose. And what lies at the heart of that is this notion of trust. Trust is one of the least well appreciated assets of business, because ultimately trusted corporations are commercially successful corporations, and the competitiveness of nations depends on the trustworthiness of its corporations for the prosperity of the many, not just the few, for the future as well as the present. Thank you very much.
Thank you. With two fascinating presentations there, and we now very fortunate that we now have Stephanie Burris of the Ahead Partnership, a social enterprise in Leeds, so we get a very interesting perspective from her.
Thank you very much, Peter. I'm just going to sit here if that's all right, and also confine my comments, I think, in response to those really two excellent talks that we've just heard on, I think, very complementary themes, both of which spoke to me in a number of ways. So just a little bit about myself. I actually have a corporate background. I trained as a lawyer in the City of London. I ended up moving up to Leeds, becoming a partner in a big law firm. I qualified as a lawyer in Germany as well. And I made quite a dramatic career change 14 years ago when I left the law, I left the corporate world, and I started a social venture, and I founded it as a social enterprise. And the reason that motivated me to do that was actually a very strong sense of purpose myself about how I wanted to apply my skills and my time. And I had been involved in some initiatives in the corporate world which had focused on looking at the skills gap, and in particular the very poor access in disadvantaged communities that young people had to opportunity. And the corporate world had been, the initiative I'd started had been doing its best to intervene in that problem. And I felt that there was an opportunity, there was a problem there was a solution that could be presented, and I felt that the social enterprise was the right model through which to do it. And I felt I was the right person to try and do it. So I started with a phone. It was just me and a desk and a phone. We now employ 30 people. We turned over just over £2 million last year. We're not a charity, we are a business. And what the wonderful thing about social enterprise is,
I suppose, an alternative and an attempt to redefine sort of capitalist enterprise, is that it really does challenge this idea that the business of business is only business. We've just been hearing about that, and combines the business objective with social goals, which then become firmly embedded in the purpose. And social enterprises operate across a number of areas. Sometimes they're looking at failures like the one that I've described, where we had a lot of young people who had no access to the workplace, to inspirational role models from the world of work, and even access to good education. And we wanted to create an environment where people from the corporate world could connect into schools, colleges, and we do work with universities as well, to inspire young people and show them how they could enter particular sectors, particular roles, help them make better decisions. And I think at this time we've touched on globalisation, we've touched on things like automation and the big disruption that is causing to the labour market. Young people have never been more in need of that sort of guidance from people in the working world than they are now. But getting back to this sense of purpose and trust, because I think those are two words that really resonated with me, and in the sort of few notes that I'd sort of scribbled down, they were both things that I wanted to bring out. I'd say over the 14 years that I have been working in the Social Enterprise Ahead Partnership, there is not one day when I've not been clear what our purpose is or why I'm going off to work. All 30 of us in the business are absolutely united and clear in why we exist, what we're trying to achieve, how we want to go about it, what our value proposition is, both internally and externally. And that has created, I think, the environment for us really to flourish. I think the second thing is really around this business of trust. Because I did have a choice when I set up the business model. Being a lawyer, I know a thing or two about corporate law. Could have chosen a for-profit model. For me, that felt completely wrong, because what I knew we were going to have to do if we were going to be successful and grow this movement of people from the working world to get involved in these projects in schools and inner city communities and so on, was to develop from a very early stage a real sense of trust, that they could trust us. We were not going to them with an ask to get involved in school projects and contribute towards the costs, the running costs of putting all of these projects on in order to line our own pockets. So I think the profit motive and removing that send a very, very clear message to the partners that we work with. Don't get me wrong, it operates as a business. There is nothing we do that we don't get paid to do. The schools, the businesses, the public bodies that work with us all pay us for our services. It could operate as a for-profit company, but I think it operates far more effectively as a social enterprise. And I think there are probably a number of organisations that would, I think, be more effective and more successful if they adopted the same model. The other thing I'd just like to comment on, having been a law student and thinking about this idea of a corporation as a legal person. I don't know, any of you lawyers in the audience? First heard that, but what does that mean, legal person? And it is a fiction. But of course, the people who work for businesses are people. And you will all go off and end up working, whether it's for public institutions or corporations, you will all end up as workforce. And this idea of corporations being depersonalised, hiding behind some sort of corporate veil, as it's often called, not accepting responsibility and not humanising and personalising the decisions that they make. I think there's a tremendous opportunity, particularly for you as young people, to go into the workforce with different expectations. And I think businesses are listening. I think they are prepared to change. I'd be very interested to hear what reception we get to the proposals that have just been outlined for the changes in alignment of purpose and management. I think they're all excellent ideas. But I think my message to all of you, as I've made my choice to run a social business, is you also have choices as you enter the workforce. You have influence, you have more power, actually, to effect change and to turn corporations into the sort of corporations you want to work for, that you're proud to work for, that you think have that value and align with your value set. Please don't waste that opportunity. I think you uniquely as a generation have it, because there is so much disruption now within corporations through digitisation and automation. I think it's a very, very radical new era that we're entering. And I think you have the power as young people growing up and coming from that era. The likes of me, at my age, we just don't have that. So I think it's a renaissance, a corporate renaissance based on values and principles. I would very much urge you to be part of that.
Thank you.
Thank you. We now have some time for questions. I'd just like to add to that set of excellent comments. I did one of the projects in the suite of projects that under the future of the corporation. On one thing, I interviewed several top managers who said that one of the pressures for change was the people joining the workforce. The new generation came with a different set of expectations and weren't just concerned about high incomes and so on, but we're actually concerned about what is this business about, what does it do, what does it contribute. So I think we're already seeing the forces that Stephanie talked about. Now, over to you. Questions? If you could just say your name. We don't need a long description of who you are, but a name, and then perhaps your question and perhaps who it's related to. Yes, gentleman there.
Yeah, my name's Ben. This is Paul. What impact do you think was had upon the nature of businesses and the role thought to be played by the corporation by the fact that there was the Reagan administration and the Thatcher administration at the exact same time?
Okay, so I think the Reagan administration introduced the line, government is the problem. And that started a narrative which is now very, very powerful in America, less so, thank goodness, in Europe, a narrative of denigration of public policy. Because capitalism periodically derails, without public policy, we're all dead, right? And so that was what came out of Reagan, the denigration of public policy. What came out of Thatcher was a different narrative. She, to her credit, she was concerned with families as vehicles for obligation. But what she said was, famously, there's no such thing as society. Okay? So she didn't see that you could move beyond the nexus of obligations within a family to a nexus of obligations across the whole society. Of course there's such a thing as society, and the task is to build that web of reciprocal obligations that we all recognize that there's, it's very much what Colin said about the firm can play out at the whole society. A sense of common purpose where we all make sacrifices for a better future. That's our common purpose, and so we all have obligations to each other to do that. Right? So that's what we mean by society. Saying there's no such thing as society denies that, and Reagan saying government's the problem denies the idea that there's anything beyond the firm. Just let the firm rip, and let the other slogan that Reagan entitled was this radical individualism, that it's just the individual and the firm, as it were. In Reagan's world, the family disappeared, and in Thatcher's world, society disappeared.
Could I just say, just add a slightly different take on this, because the common component that really has been enduring and reflects where we stand today was obviously on the operation of markets and the relevance of taking government out and putting privatization and regulation in its place. And basically, the legacy that we inherit to date is a reflection of a pursuit of those policies on both sides of the Atlantic, both emanating from very similar underlying principles and dogmas around the type of Friedman Doctrine that I was talking about, namely of the importance of markets and the reason why one needs to have a separation. I mean, one of the main elements behind Friedman's argument was to separate democratic processes from corporate processes and not to allow the two to become confused and muddled. And that had set in place a train of developments which until now have really not been questioned in a serious way. And that's why when the Labour Party, this country, put forward the notion of nationalisation, it came as a remarkable shock to a lot of people who presumed that we'd essentially come to almost a global consensus around the merits of privatisation and the need for regulation where markets are not sufficient on their own.
I think two things on that. First of all, to you, Colin, I was surprised that you said putting BlackRock's CEO to one side for the moment, because, of course, since Friedman came up and others with stakeholder versus shareholder, and we're going back 30 years, and that is, you know, one of the things which is taught in MBA course. Sure. So I think there has been that movement for quite a while. So I'm interested why you didn't mention that. That seems to be what, you know, what you're suggesting. There should be more of the shareholder.
Okay, so well, first of all, let's be clear that the Friedman one's talking about in relation to stakeholders is different from the Friedman that we're talking about in terms of
yeah, Friedman.
That's right, exactly. And it's important to draw that distinction because the Friedman view was essentially that one needs to think about stakeholders in the context of what promotes the success of companies, including in terms of promoting the success of the profitability of companies. So it was not, in essence, necessarily in conflict with the Friedman Doctrine, and it's sometimes now encapsulated in what is termed enlightened shareholder views of companies, namely that an enlightened shareholder view is that actually it's in the interest of shareholders to take account of other stakeholders in the firm, because if you look after your employees, then that helps to generate more profits for the firm. If you look after the societies in which you operate, then you're likely to be less regulated. So that is what is sometimes termed an extrinsic purpose of the company. Namely, that is to say, it's still shareholder driven, but with an enlightened view of the relevance of other parties. What it doesn't incorporate, and what differentiates what I'm talking about and the notion of purpose is about, is that there can be an intrinsic purpose to the company. An intrinsic purpose in terms of pursuing the interests of customers or societies or the environment, which is still profitable, but is not necessarily what underpins the Friedman Doctrine, namely to profit maximize. And that is really the fundamental issue that's distinguishing what, for example, you were talking about, Stephanie, and what underpins the concepts that I'm talking about from these enlightened shareholder approaches, because they're still about how do you get the maximum return for shareholders. And that is what can create serious drawbacks for the rest of society if one simply thinks about a firm as being an instrument for maximizing shareholder value as against delivering what I was just describing as being the solutions to the problems of people and planet, albeit in a profitable way, not as a charitable activity, not as just corporate social responsibility, but something that is inherent to the company but isn't necessarily delivering maximum returns to shareholders.
Yeah, it's sorry, Adam Crawford,
Yeah.
in Social Science
Yeah.
Institute. It's probably more a comment, and it's something which is kind of, and it maybe speaks to something which you said less about rather than what you did say about, but it picks up on particularly the kind of the idea of people as human agents,
Yes.
and particularly the kind of historical thing. So I suppose from a different perspective, a different set of cleavages or a different set of derailments that climate scientists and atmosphere scientists and geologists are writing is that industrialisation and capitalism, the history of Titus Salt, of course, actually could be written very differently about actually as contributing to hell on earth in a slightly different understanding, which is actually the environmental degradation, not in its immediate, but in terms of the Anthropocene, in terms of that moment in time, and there's debates about the particular dating of the Anthropocene, that we have entered a new era which requires a new moral agenda and a new ethic, which is that we, as humans, are not only moral agents, but we have become, environmental agents in terms of actually the production of the... Now, that sits outside, so Titus Salt may have been contributing to Saltaire in positive ways, but Titus Salt was also contributing to hell on earth in terms of the impact of the CO2 emissions, fossil fuels, etc. That in many senses is the contemporary moral challenge that the corporations feel, and I wonder where that sits.
Yeah, I mean, we can't blame people like Titus Salt because until, about 30 years ago, nobody knew any about this, right? So it's in that sense, it's foolish saying, the past is to blame and this particular set of the past or this particular set of places, they're not to blame because there was no knowledge, right? You start to become blameworthy once you deliberately are doing things that you know are damaging. And that's back to Colin's purpose. And we now know, and it's very important to act on that. But look, it's the dominant refrain amongst young people now, concern about climate change, concern to do something about it. It's then important that we cast the science intelligently. Rather than sort of as a sort of fashion player. This hit me very, very hard when I have a friend she's Polish, she's early 20s, and she, like many young people, she's passionately concerned with climate change. But I had to explain to her that climate change, doing something about it, if we do anything about it, we need to close the world's coal industry. And as a Pole, we're just contributing to climate change. So I don't need light to talk, and you don't need light to listen. So we'll carry on until somebody fixes this. But it had never struck her. She was very concerned about climate change. She believed in all these targets and what have you, but she'd never connected with the thought that complying with the targets meant closing coal. And as a loyal Pole, who was morally God in her currency? Polish coal miners. And I've never seen anyone so conflicted.
Can I
Sorry.
The two questions that I've noticed? Gentleman there and lady there, and I think probably that's going to be quick.
Yeah. So this is a question for both of you, but especially you, Paul. Is it sort of between sort of 1945 and sort of the mid 70s, British governments of whichever political persuasion were aimed to what Sir William Beveridge aimed for, a high and stable level of employment, so unemployment 3% or less. In your opinion, how is that to be achieved? Surely companies can't really do much about that. Surely it's the role of government, by whichever means, to ensure. Shouldn't that be the aim of society? Because unemployment causes huge social and economic problems.
Thank you. Can we have your question as well?
Yeah, so I want to know what you think about the causes of the lack of integrity, honesty, lack of working for the common good, all the things you've talked about, lack of moral compass in business and politics at the moment. What do you think of that being the result of the secularisation of society?
Thank you.
Two very good questions.
Colin, do you want to take the second one and I'll take the first?
Yes. Let me just, before I do that, just respond to your point, because I think there's a very important element that Paul was just bringing out in terms of the extent to which one cannot ascribe blame to corporations for things that they did not recognise. So, for example, it was the case that a lot of the Quaker companies like Cadbury at the beginning of the 20th century focused on chocolate as a commodity, because chocolate was regarded as being a way of encouraging people to move away from having ale for breakfast, and they had a nice hot cup of cocoa instead as their drink for breakfast. And it so happens that 100 years later, 150 years later, we now recognise that there's another problem associated with cocoa, and that is that of diabetes and sugar intake. And so it's important that companies then react to those changes in terms of essentially responding as rapidly as they can to develop their activities. But one shouldn't say that the fact that they're starting off doing things that we now recognise as being detrimental is necessarily a reflection of a lack of purpose. It's what you do in response to those activities. Why don't you take the next two questions?
Okay, so first, the point about productivity and employment. And people need to have a job in order to have a sense of self-worth. And we're a long way from moving away from that. We've got to run our society, our economy in such a way that productivity, useful skills is very widely diffused. And in Britain, we're terrible at that. We've got some of the best universities in the world. And so if you want cognitive skills and you've got cognitive abilities, you're in the right country, right? But if you're not amongst the cognitively most gifted and you want to get some non-cognitive skills, you're in the wrong country, right? Now, if we look around to other countries, there's a lot that can be done. This is pragmatism for you. You learn from others. You have the modesty, the humility to say, we're doing it badly, let's look who's doing it well. You look at Finland, you look at Switzerland, you look at Germany, right? And you recognise that it's not just the vocational skills. The problems start to derail much, much earlier in life. Derailment happens when people, when children are born, if they're born into a family that is chaotic. And so there's instead of this top-down social paternalism, which tries to order people about and has got worse and worse and worse, what I advocate in the book is social maternalism, which starts with the birth of a child and tries to put people back on the rails all the way along the system. We could learn from France with its école maternelle, which socialised the child from 2.5 to 5. They do that because they're free, they're standardised, they're everywhere, everybody goes. It's only if everybody goes that the poorest go. And that's been the big failure in Britain. And then schools. At the moment, our schools we think of them as places where people learn things. Actually, they are sites as well as organizations. They're sites where children come together. And at the moment, the big criterion for is how much money you've got to buy a house. And so our schools amplify social divergence instead of reducing it. Because the kids with the highly functional parents go to the very good schools, and they learn from each other. You learn mostly from your peers, and it amplifies. Right? And then, when you get into your teens, one thing you need is mentors. Mentors, people who are not judgmental, but can help you. Right? When I was in my teens, the most important decision in my life was, should I go to university to read law, or should I see sense and become an economist? And I didn't know what to do. Right? And I didn't know anybody to ask. Right? Because both my parents had left school from when they were 12. We didn't know anybody. Right? And so the only middle-class person I could think to ask was my dentist. Right? And he turned out to be completely useless. Right? If we look at the surveys of social connectedness, and the people do, there's work on this, the biggest difference in the whole lifespan between the poor and the rich is the answer, do you know a professor? Right? With my family, it was like saying, do you know the Queen? Right? With my family now, when my son Daniel decided he wanted to do nanotechnology, all he had to do was go next door and ask Oxford's professor of nanotechnology. So these are all the way along the line. We can do a lot that we're not doing to make everybody productive, right? And that's the task. Yes. The second question was, just remind me.
About what do you think of the reasons for the lack of integrity in moral compass being part of like the secularization of society?
Oh yes, and do you know that's a very common criticism of the future of capitalism, that I don't discuss the decline of religion, and I think it's right. I think it's right. It's completely right. That if you go back historically, as Colin said, a lot of the good firms, the purposive firms, were Quaker firms or whatever, What is the answer to that? It's probably not restore religion. Right? It's probably not on the menu in many societies. The best we can do, though, is motivate people by a sense of purpose around a shared future. And there's got to be a strong and credible purpose that unites us. And we've been singularly bad in our political leaders and our business leaders, singularly bad in bringing in a sense of togetherness. We share a common fate. One of you, I forget which one, asked, how is all this being received? And that was a very good question in which to end, I think. And the answer is, yes, there is some pushback, but very little, and it's from a very particular source. It is not from business people. It is just not. Businesses, and Colin does more of this than I do, but businesses are now very strong sense of we need purpose. Ordinary citizens, and we give a lot of these talks, ordinary citizens have a very strong sense of we can do this. We want moral agency. We can be morally load-bearing actors. We don't have to have all the morality go up to the state. Right? Where's the opposition? Where's the pushback? It's from the ideologues, the political ideologues of both the far right and the far left. They hate the idea of together a common purpose for the benefit of all of us. The far right is still wedded on this crazy Friedmanite kind of world, allied with a powerful narrative of individualism. individual self-achievement, my right to do whatever I want. Right? By the time we get to America, some of it's truly crazy. They think that public parks they shouldn't be used because they're immoral. They represent an affront to people in the past who've been exploited to have to pay for the public parks. I mean, this is sort of the higher insanity. But you get the same on the left, right? The same on the extreme left. The extreme left wants opposition. It hates the idea of we together. It wants to say, no, it's our class versus these evil people. And so I'm very proud that the future of capitalism, which, like prosperity, has got an extraordinarily strong support in both the press and endorsements, but the future of capitalism has united two political commentators in opposition to it. Dominic Lawson on the far right and Paul Mason on the far left. They both denounce it. I must be on the right path. Thank you.
Thank you. So if I could just say something to complement that in relation to the role of business in essentially addressing the issue that both those questions raise. First of all, the reason why what I was just describing as intrinsic purpose is so important in this regard is that it is required to really create the relations of trust that I was talking about as being critical. If you can think about it in terms of the way in which firms treat their employees and the importance of us as we move into it and you move into your careers, of finding something that you are going to find gives you real fulfillment from your future careers. Not just the highest income that you can earn, but something that you can feel really proud about doing, then that requires a commitment on the part of the firms for whom you're working to help you achieve that, to help you be trained to do that, to help to ensure that your career progression is one that allows you to fulfill that sense of purpose. And you can't expect that of companies that simply perceive their role as being there to maximize the interests of their shareholders, irrespective of the consequence that that may have for their employees, or only take account of the interests of their employees to the extent that it promotes the interest of their shareholders. They have to have an intrinsic interest in your well-being as employees. And exactly the same applies not just to employees, but to society and to nature. That if it's the case that we see companies that are pursuing profit as their sole objective, then it has potentially very damaging consequences for a society and environment. And I want to illustrate this by ending by talking about a company that had its origins here in Leeds and became the most successful company in Britain for many years, for many decades. It was, of course, Marks and Spencer's, which had its origins here in Leeds. And it grew to be the most highly respected and trusted company in Britain as a family-owned firm. A family-owned firm that the Seifs played a very direct and engaged role in ensuring had clearly defined purposes and clearly defined values. Values which talked about the importance of looking after their employees and helping them to develop their sense of fulfillment and purpose. And in particular, it also had a very strong commitment not only to its employees, but to society through using local, national companies to be the suppliers of the cloth and the garments and the food that Marks and Spencer's became so well known for providing to such a high standard. And it did that by building up relations of trust with those suppliers And it became a matter of pride to the C family and to those running the companies that they should have a strong relationship, that their suppliers could trust. But then, as you'll be aware, during the end of the 1980s and the 1990s, a fundamental change took place to the company. The C family sold out their shares. The company was became a public company, and its shareholding shifted from being a family-owned company to being a widely held, dispersed company on the stock market. And the consequence of that was exactly what I've been talking about. It shifted from being a company where there was an identifiable owner that was concerned about its community to being one where there were dispersed shareholders, anonymous shareholders, where there was no possibility of the management of the company having a relationship with their owners. They were forced to focus on one objective, and that was to maximize the share price of the company. And what did they do? Well, first of all, its emphasis on its employees changed virtually overnight, but so too did its relationships with its suppliers. And from being a company that focused on local and domestic suppliers, it shifted to a global supply chain. And that global supply chain then eliminated those relationships of trust, and it has never been able to re-establish that same sort of principles that underpinned it when it was a family company. And I think that that really illustrates a lot of what Paul and I are talking about, the importance of intrinsic relationships of trust that create those forms of commitment, and how different that is from the conventional view of what firms are there to do. Thank you.
I'd like to thank our speakers for a very stimulating evening and our commentator for her insights as well. And thank you all for being such a fantastic, engaged audience. Thank you all.